invest in people in the long term, there has to be a mutual understanding.
Hustle hard. Closed mouths don't get fed. Thinking strategically, but acting like a gorilla is the kind of marketing that's small for the planet. Innovate very little. It's highly risk averse. And it takes
There was a whole industry called the taxi industry, and it actually was lumped in with taxis and limousines. And limousines, if you think about it, and I didn't think about it until I started looking into this Uber case, there's not a lot of limos on the road anymore either. And so taxi cab industry and the limo industry essentially morphed into an industry called rideshare because of this platform application called Uber. So Uber fundamentally changed the industry, and it was done intentionally. It wasn't, they didn't accidentally stumble upon it. They saw the opportunity to formidably shape the industry or change the industry. There's really two things that we need to think about strategically when we go through the industry analysis. Number one is what's happening in the industry that we can use our capabilities and our competencies and our resources that we currently have to match the opportunities in the industry. So we're looking at the industry to find opportunities and see how our competencies, our resources can match it. Essentially, oh, hey, we can do that. So you're essentially conforming to the industry. Or the other way to look at it is you look at an industry and say there's real opportunity for change here. And our resources and our capabilities can actually change this industry. So to change it is a pretty bold step, and it usually requires significant thought, a blue ocean strategy, if you would, like looking into the horizon and seeing something completely new. It's a great book called The Blue Ocean Strategy if you ever want to read it. And it's finding a completely new industry. And I think it was yellowtail wine was an example they used in the book. You'd go to the wine store and you have these really, really expensive options, or let's just say there were $50 bottles of wine, and you'd have these cheap options like Bago, this wine that tasted horrible. And Yellowtail came in and created an entire market for essentially a basic, $20, $22 bottle of wine that was fairly decent taste. And a lot of people never had that option. So that's just an example of creating a new space to operate within an industry. That's a good example of a blue ocean strategy. So why is industry analysis important? If you think about strategy formulation, the first thing you need to go through is an industry analysis to see how the current industry is operating. A wonderful, and I pulled up, if you see on my screen here, an IBIS world report. If you're in a business class and you want to, let's say you're working and you want to impress your boss, here, IBIS World Industry Research is one of the best industry research platforms ever. And within here, you can look up any industry. You have to have something called an NAICS code or an SIC code. So you have to understand you have to define the industry. What is the name of your industry? You can see some here: IT consulting in US, fast food restaurants in US, commercial leasing in US, and you can see the code next to it. And then based on that code, and I put up an example of the fast food restaurant, you get this beautiful report. Only you have access to this. This is a $150 report that could be significantly valuable to your company or to your boss or to your leader at work if you print it out and give it to them. And some aren't really privy to this information. So the fast food industry, to know a little bit about the fast food industry, we have to know certain stats. It's got $417 billion in revenue in the fast food industry. There's 5 million employees. There's 216,000 businesses that are registered as fast food restaurants in the US. The profit is 19 billion. You can see the profit margin right there is 4.6%, which is not that high, by the way. It's actually fairly low. And then you can see how much wages they pay. These are just some interesting facts or takeaways. Fast food restaurants, I'm reading the key takeaways, are adding healthy, low-calorie options due to increased competition. That's a trend. These outlets must continuously innovate and adapt to evolving dietary preferences to draw customers. Restaurants are embracing tech to tackle staffing concerns and sustain profit. The COVID-19 pandemic has expedited this shift, primarily by establishing self-ordering kiosks. We all know that now, but it's just a fascinating concept that this is what's happening. So external, which is the essence of what we're going to talk about today, is these external drivers. Consumer spending is good. Domestic trips by U.S. residents is good. Consumer confidence index is good. Healthy eating index, I guess, is negative. Urban population is positive. Executive summary: while shifting consumer preferences and a crowded food service landscape, fast food restaurants have maintained a steady pace of growth. Over the 5 years of 2025 to 2025, industry revenue has expanded at a CAGR of 3.9%, reaching 400 billion. Notably, 2025 alone will experience a 1.1% increase in revenue. So this is a 45-page report that is going to give you all sorts of information on the industry. And obviously, you can plug this into an AI and you could ask it specific questions, which is awesome. So I wanted to show that to you. And it really answers this question, why industry analysis matters. There's an entire library of researchers, entire group of researchers, entire organization that spends all of their professional time, energy, and effort gathering stats about an industry and reporting on them and putting them into data and putting them into text, identifying trends, identifying opportunities, identifying threats, and talking about the industry. So this has been going on for a long time. And so it's what's happening inside our company. We talked last time about the business unit is the internal environment. This is the organization. And within our company, we have our employees, we have our facilities, we have our culture. These are all important things. And that's called the internal environment. The task environment involves our competitors, suppliers, distributors, customers. That's really a little bit more about the industry that we're talking about. And this bigger environment, the macro environment, is technological forces, social cultural forces, demographic forces, political and legal forces, and economic forces. Today we're not talking about this yet at all. We're really talking about this, competitors, suppliers, customers, and distributors, and we're talking a little bit about the general environment. Most, if not all, strategists will assert that the instance of strategy has to start from the external and work its way in. And to identify opportunities and threats is one of the most important things you can do. Put this slide in here so you can see some examples of what happens within a company: organizational politics, accidents, scandals, products and service innovations, facility relocation, reshuffling responsibilities, performance standards. These are things that a lot of you may be used to talking about on a day in and day out basis. These are common things that a lot of business students know about because you're talking about a company, right? This is not what I want to focus on tonight, and it's not what we're going to focus on at the beginning of this class. We're going to focus more on, as you can see, these two. What we need to focus on is these exterior ones. This includes economic environment, competitive environment, labor environment. What's the labor environment? That's a big deal. A union operating under union standards, increasing minimum wage, which is something that you can't control. That's a big one. There you go. How about access to labor? I mean, you just think about if you need 15 people to come work for you immediately, how do you find these people? And are they of quality? And you might need to hire somebody just to help you find these people. So your access to labor, how about your facility where it's located? Let's say you have a business down in Key West and it's the hospitality business. You just built a hotel. How are you going to find people to stay at this hotel that want to live in Key West? Certainly something that you should consider in business. We have our facility is located in Florida City. And one of the core reasons why we located our facility in Florida City, most of our business was in the Keys, and most of our business was in like South Miami Beach or Miami Beach. So we had high-end, wealthy homeowners that would clean their pools and did their landscape in Miami. And we had high-end, healthy homeowners that clean their pools and did landscapes in the Keys. But our workforce, the people we needed to cut the grass and clean the pools and build the pools and all this kind of stuff, where do you think they live? Do you think they live down in the Keys, or do you think they lived in Miami Beach? Homestead area. And so what we were able to do is, first of all, know that because that was pretty clear. And then not only that, but we were able to create a work environment where they, as soon as they came to the facility, they started their work. So this is a big deal. So come to the facility, clock in. You know, for anybody working in the labor force, that's like, wow, that's really convenient. So as soon as they come to work, I'm on the clock. And then from there, they jump in a company truck and they would commute to their first stop of the day. So they knew they were getting paid. I mean, there's obviously some downtime for us, but we were able to attract people because of that. Imagine if we said, you know, our business is in our facilities in Florida City, but we're not going to pay you until you get to your first job. So you create all sorts of political nonsense, believe me. And also there was a toll on Card Sound for this extended period of time. We're going to get into all the logistics of our organization, but that created a roadblock in our staff members' minds, thinking they had to pay for the toll. So how do we differentiate ourselves? Well, we became an organization located in Florida City, which meant that if you come there, all you got to do is get a ride to Florida City. And from there, you start getting paid. And from there, you take a company truck, or from there, you take a van. We are going to provide transit to the job. And that was huge. And we also pay for tolls. So where other companies, they couldn't do that, or they didn't have a facility located there. So that was very important. Access to labor. Move away from that point. So this is all external environment, resource environment, customer environment, legal and regulatory. That's a big one when we talk about Uber tonight. Global environment, customers, and technology. So what's happening in this external environment? I tried to kind of symbolize it here. You can see these people that are in the office sort of just hanging out. This is like a good example of COVID. You know, you got a hospital system here. And then what's happening outside? It's called turbulence. It's wild. Things are active. Things are changing. You know, AI is coming out. Uber is disrupting technology. Medical technology is changing things. Environmental issues, political issues, geopolitical issues. Things are happening that are just turbulent. It's a great aspect. And turbulence, and I love these words, and you don't have to know these words, I just love them. Dynamism, hostility, and complexity would fall under the category of political and legal forces. And that creates turbulence and it creates uncertainty. And organizations that we're going to talk about in this class know how to respond to that. Because prior to becoming an organization and prior to making strategic decisions and prior to gathering resources, we understand that there could be turbulence in the environment and we have to prepare for it. So a good example. So when you think about 10 years from now? I know it's kind of hard to think about. Do you think there's going to be more change or less change? So, what is your response going to be? Am I supposed to be teaching you the subject matter of turbulence in the external environment? What kind of mindset should we go into in business? About 1,000 different variables happening right now in the external environment that present turbulence, and that's in one specific sector. But it's a good example. It's just another example of dynamism, hostility, and complexity. But we're not here to point out examples. And I go back to the question that I'm going to ask, and I hope that we have some creative insight into how we respond. How are we supposed to respond to the inevitability of turbulence in the environment? But so if I know that I'm going to adapt, I mean, inevitably that's kind of what my mindset is towards. So if I know that in the future change is coming and I can plan for that change, there's another word that starts with an A that we can do to, I want to say it, to something to change. Not only can we adapt once we have it, but we can anticipate that it's coming. We can forecast it. We know that it's happening, and we could design our organizations, design our executive team to be ready for it in a sense. I mean, there's certain things that we should push back against. You know, we understand that we can advocate for whatever it is we need to advocate for, and certainly for if the change is really going to impact us, and if we could have some persuasive power, we could try to fight against it, and that might be a fruitful fight. But inevitably, at the end of the day, it's going to meet somewhere in between. Remember that emergent strategy? We have our hope for strategy, whatever that plan strategy, and then we have an emergent strategy, and then that's what really is going to be our realized strategy. So, all right, let's get out of this because I want to get through these slides and I want to get you guys into your breakout session so you can really talk through what it looks like to take a look at an industry. So, Porter's five forces. This is something that I hope that you can take away from you as a tool to use in your mind all the time, often, but also in your business, in whatever businesses you're in the future. When I say your business, this means where you work in any kind of way, or a business that you're thinking about getting into. And just for this class, threats of new entrants. Are the barriers to entry high? Is it inevitable that a bunch of other competitors are going to get into this industry? If the answer to that is yes, there's very low barriers to entry and high threats of new entrants. That's not a good thing. That means a ton of people can come into this industry. So if we're not in the industry, then we know that we're going to compete pretty hard because a lot of people get in. If we're already in the industry, it's tough because we know new people are coming. So that's one. Obviously, we want to create barriers to entry, and we want low threats of new entrants if we're an incumbent, if we're currently in an industry. Okay, threat of substitutes. What is a substitute for taking an Uber? If I'm at my house right now and I want to go to my friend's house or I want to go to the airport, and Uber is not available, what's another option? Lyft would be a competitor. It's not necessarily a substitute because it's a competitor. A substitute would be walking, public transportation, your own personal car. I think somebody said that. What else? Some you car share with somebody else, your neighbor. I mean, this is usually how people got around before Uber and Lyft and all this kind of stuff. So if there are substitutes, so let's look at another example. As opposed to taking a plane somewhere, what are some alternatives to flying to Orlando? I can do what? There's a great alternative. I can drive myself. I can simply not go. I can choose not to go. I mean, that's a substitute too. Stay home. So if it's really easy for me to just stay home, then that's another substitute for I was thinking about going on a plane flight, but geez, the plane flights are really high and I'm just going to stay home. It's no travel at all. So these are substitutes to a particular situation. I'm sure I can think of other examples, but let's keep moving. So bargaining power of buyers. This is a big one. As consumers walking around the Dadeland Mall, how high is our bargaining power when we go to a restaurant in the food court and we pick a number 7 at the Kentucky Fried Chicken and we say we would like a number 7, please, and we see on there that it's $9, and then the lady says to us or the guy says to us that's checking us out, okay, that'll be $9, sir. Can I bargain with them at that particular time? It's a set price. My bargaining power. They look at me with a roll their eyes and be like, I'm not sure about that. How about if a landscape company comes to my house to quote me on doing my landscape maintenance, and they come over and they say, hey, Claude, it's going to be $250 a month. We're going to come cut your grass twice a month. Can I bargain with them? Bargaining power as a buyer in the landscape industry than I do as a buyer in the food product or software or drink product industry, because I'm just a buyer of multiple different fast foods options, or I'm a buyer of one particular landscape service. So what I'm trying to alleviate via example is to demonstrate to you that in certain situations as a buyer, you have power. And in certain situations, you don't. You either take the price or you leave it. That's it. And so what we're going to talk about how the taxi cab industry operated for a while and now how it's being done with this new rideshare industry. Okay, bargaining power of suppliers. We had for a long time this contractor that would supply us with chlorine for our pool company. Chlorine was like liquid gold to us. We needed chlorine in order to service our pools. It was technically called bleach, but it was very important. And we had an organization called Allied that was supplying us with chlorine. They had a big tanker. We had a chlorine tank, two chlorine tanks, which was great, and had a permit installed at our facilities. And the pool techs would just come and fill up their chlorine. It was amazing. We didn't have to go to a pool store to get our chlorine. But when COVID hit, they decided, because we're really far south, that they were going to take our price per gallon of chlorine from like, I don't know, it was like $2. They were going to raise it to $3. And we had a bunch of chlorine. And we were like, wait a minute. You know what I mean? You're a supplier to us, and you are telling us how much we're going to pay. And we're literally going to pay 38% more or 34% more than we were paying before. That's a big hike right there. And so they said, okay, well, you can either take that price or you can leave. And so they told us what price we were going to pay. We didn't have many options. So they had good bargaining power. If we were to, let's say that, what's another option? If we were to go to buy plywood at a local construction supply shop, and we went to, say, Home Depot, and Home Depot's plywood was astronomically high. And I looked at the price. I could very well just say, no, no, thank you. I'm not going to buy from you. I'm going to the 15 other suppliers of plywood that I can go find. And they have less bargaining power because they're not going to tell me how much I'm going to pay for plywood. I can shop around. So you get the idea. Bargaining power of suppliers is a factor. Rivalry among competitors, existing competitors, is a factor too. Each one of these is a conversation in itself. But let's look at how Uber did this. So if you take a look at this visual, and this is kind of a key takeaway to the next, 30, 45 minutes, is seeing, if you look at this traditional taxi cab industry, and these here, you'll see I labeled all of these different porters, five forces here, and then you have the extent, 5 is high, 1 is low, of threats of new entrants. So if more new entrants came in, a threat of new entrants is a 5, it means it's high. So it's got high threats of new entrants. Bargaining power of suppliers is a 5, which, as you can see here, we'll talk about in a second. Of traditional taxi cab companies, bargaining power of suppliers is really high, and suppliers were the medallion owners. So that's super high. Versus industry rivalry, over here, you can see how Uber was able to create even more rivalry within the industry. Threat of substitutes, and then bargaining power of buyers. This is a big one. Bargaining power of buyers being high is bad for the company because obviously the company now has to obey by the commands or the demands of the buyer, but it's very, very, very good for the industry because it creates more perfect competition. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to unpack Porter's five forces from the prehistoric taxi cab industry. So I'm going to show you all of these factors and what was going on within the taxi cab industry. And then you all are going to go and do it for Uber, for the new ride sharing industry, what Uber did. So essentially, I'm going to outline this, and then we're going to watch a video about Uber. So I'm going to talk about this from the traditional taxi cab industry, and then you're going to talk about, and the yellow here, you're going to talk about this. You can see how fundamentally different the industry is once Uber came in. And this is what we're going through right now. This is called external analysis. This is called industry analysis. Well, I'm going to move past this. So before Uber, the taxi industry was heavily regulated. Regulation is not necessarily a good thing for perfect competition. It's not necessarily a good thing for new people who want to come into the industry. And it's not necessarily a good thing for consumers or customers. Why? Because the incumbents, who are the people existing in the industry, they like the regulation because they've already set up shop. So they want regulation. Medallions or licenses were scarce, issued by city governments. And by the way, the governments were taking about $100,000 every time a license was on the third party. A medallion was given out to another taxi cab company. The governments were in on the gain of revenue from the taxi cab industry. So the government wanted the taxi cab industry to be successful because they were sort of a part of it. They were colluding with the companies. And so that's why Uber ran into a lot of different lawsuits and different issues, because in local cities or municipalities, they were really infringing upon the government revenue as well, and often cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions of dollars for medallion. These licenses weren't just permits, they were the rent yielding factor of production. Whoever controlled them controlled the market. So whoever controlled these licenses. So here's the first one in the taxi cab industry. In the traditional taxi cab world, this was very low. This is the threat of new entrants. You couldn't just wake up one day and start driving people for money. It didn't happen. Nowadays, I think it might take 3 days, maybe a week, if not less time, to get on Uber. You have to have a legitimate car and a license. You might have to do a background check. Very quickly can you become an Uber driver. Back then, no, sir. No, ma'am. You can't just become a taxi cab driver. You had to go through a process. You had to find a taxi cab company. They had to have a medallion. You had to be an independent contractor. You had to pass some sort of test in order to become a taxi cab driver. It wasn't that easy. And it certainly wasn't easy to get a medallion. You needed a medallion, an approved vehicle in some cities. You had to pass extensive knowledge or language tests. The limited supply of licenses meant new entrants were kept out. This created artificial scarcity. Artificial scarcity is huge. Lululemon did this. I think there was some stat where, and you'll see it in the video, that New York City had 13,000 cabs in like 1994. And in 2002, they had 14,000 cabs. So they created this artificial scarcity where we don't think there's a lot of cabs. So obviously we're going to pay more money for cabs because there's not so many of them. They controlled the supply of cabs. The barrier protected incumbents and ensured high asset values for license holders. So unless you were part of the club, you didn't get in. So force two. So remember, that was the threat of new entrants. Force two is bargaining power of suppliers. This is extremely high. If you remember this visual here in the taxi cab industry, this is one of the most crucial aspects of the industry analysis. In this context, the supplier was the medallion owner, not the driver. In many cities, medallion holders weren't even the ones driving. They leased their license and vehicles to drivers who had to pay steep daily or weekly rates, sometimes 40 to 50% of their earnings. So I read that their taxi cab drivers were making roughly $30,000 to $35,000 a year, and they had to work 50, 60-hour weeks in order to do that. And I also read that when Uber first came out, I don't think this is the case anymore, that if you work the equivalent amount of time, 40, 50 hours a week on Uber, you could make in some cities between $80,000 and $90,000 a year.
No
So not
anymore.
only, yeah, not anymore, unfortunately, because of the supply. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the disruption of this technology created value for the suppliers, so for the drivers, and it also created a lot of value for the customers as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. So the medallion was the golden goose. This meant suppliers had enormous power and drivers had very little power. This skewed relationship created a fragile economic structure, a few at the top capturing most of the value, medallion holders, while most workers at the base struggled. So that's a tough situation in an industry. All right, two more here, and then I'm going to let you do the Uber side of it. Buyers had almost no power. This is a crucial fact. If you guys remember taking taxi cabs when you were young, or just 15 years ago, I was about 28 when Uber came out, and I've still had to take many taxi cabs since. The experience was uncertain. The car may have not smelled very well. One time I had an experience where the person charged me way too much money. They got lost, and it was just a horrible experience. And I called the dispatcher who had given me the taxi, and the dispatcher is just a third party. Dispatcher doesn't care, have any autonomy or authority over the taxi cab driver. Dispatcher didn't want to talk to me. Tough, she said. So I still had to pay for my taxi cab. I couldn't even complain to anybody, and the experience was horrible. And maybe some of you have had similar situations. So you couldn't negotiate price. You couldn't rate your driver. If the cab was late, dirty, or didn't show up, too bad. Prices were set by regulators. There were limited alternatives unless you wanted to wait for a bus, drive it yourself, or walk. Those are substitutes. So even with poor service, taxis stayed in business because substitutes were weaker, but that wouldn't last forever. Threat of substitutes, moderate. You could take public transportation, drive, walk, or book a limousine, but none were a perfect replacement. Limousines required advanced booking and weren't allowed to pick people up off the street. Buses and trains followed fixed routes. Taxis held a unique middle ground. Convenience, flexibility, and door-to-door access. That's why even when they were subpar, people still used them. And limousines were obviously very expensive. So a taxi cab would be more competitive on price. And then the last one, rivalry among existing competitors was relatively low. There were multiple taxi companies in each city, but they weren't aggressively competing on service. They had no incentive to innovate. That's a big one. No incentive to innovate because the market was protected. The lack of dynamic competition created stagnation. So now Uber. And Uber changed everything. And I want to be as clear as possible about this because this is the beginning of this platform-based revolution, and Uber paved the way. If you're thinking strategically in this class, and if you have any access or control of resources within your company, and I certainly as an educator, think about this, new faculty member, I've been here for a year, I'm a businessman. I see how the college environment and education is changing. I don't know if it's going to come back to traditional models, which I hope it does, and I think there's always going to be room for that. But if you think about the threat of new entrants, of competitors, I know there's a lot of major organizations out there that have some of the best professors in the world. I mean, even the Huberman Lab podcast would be a competitor to a lot of science-based stuff. They are putting content out there for people to see and to access. Look at YouTube platform. It is unbelievable how education is changing. So I take this into consideration every time I operate within this world, and hopefully you will as well. So Uber didn't just compete with taxis. It changed the rules of the game. It used technology to bypass traditional constraints and redefine the customer experience. Uber took existing underused resources, people with cars, and matched them with demand using an elegant mobile app. It added features taxis never had, driver ratings, GPS tracking, digital payments, real-time arrival times, and flexible pricing through surge mechanics. This reshaped every force in the industry. This is just the Porter's 5 forces. For instance, if you're in group one, you're going to answer the question, how did Uber lower the barriers to entry, meaning more people can come in now that Uber did what they did. How did they do that? In the ride for hire industry, what role did technology play? So Uber changed the industry, but Uber likely wants to now create barriers for other people to come in because now that they're situated in the industry as an incumbent, they're strategically trying to make sure other people don't get in. Yet, because they use the platform base and because they used an application, they now opened up the world of tech people and software engineers to come mimic and replicate what they did and to do it better and differently. And so, what did Uber do, intentionally or unintentionally, to open up these barriers to entry, essentially lower the barriers to entry? Number two is, how did Uber shift the power of suppliers, the drivers? Who had the power before? Medallion holders. Who has it now? How did Uber impact the bargaining power of buyers, riders, and what changed? Analyze how Uber increased industry rivalry. Who are the new competitors and what's the new basis for competition? And then lastly, what are the substitute threats for Uber and how do they compare to taxis? Is Uber more or less vulnerable to substitutes today? Limo company. And I lived next door to a gentleman who owned a limo company when I was younger. And he had like 6 of these things called town cars. You can imagine these town cars. And then a couple vans and stuff like that. Let's say that he wants to put his town cars on the app. And this is just a scenario to think about what it does to the business owner and what it does to the drivers. It wouldn't make any sense for him as a business to put his town cars on the app because the drivers of the town cars would essentially have to use the app. And so what I'm thinking is that if he's got all these drivers, they're just going to quit and they're going to go get their own town car and they're just going to be in business for themselves. I guess it's kind of a question. Or if I was a business, is there a way for me to like put my town cars in collective on the app and have my drivers use the app on like a business basis? I believe that the fleet of cars or a business that owns a fleet of cars is now obsolete. Meaning, what's going to happen, I'm assuming, is that all of their drivers just leave this guy and go and just drive Uber. And or the alternative would just be to stick to the old model and to just go and drive for this guy based on wherever he sends you. But I wouldn't be using the Uber app. I would be utilizing the platform that the owner supplies me with and the protocols that I used to use. And again, this is just a thought to consider of how, yes, it created more entrants, it created more drivers, which is great because before, remember, you needed to find a medallion, you needed to, there's all sorts of hoops you had to jump through in order to be a taxi cab driver. Now you can, like Hortensia said, you can literally fill out the I-9 on the phone. You're in business for yourself within, I don't know, 3 days at the most. And so that would be good for the individuals, but it wouldn't necessarily be good for the business owners that had taxi cab companies, or not taxi cab companies. Well, yeah, taxi cab companies too, but also just town cars that they used for services or limousines. I think those companies are struggling too. So it's good, but then bad at the same time. If you can imagine Miami, and in Miami, this is circa 2010, so meaning like say 2009, you had, you're going to have a birthday party. You're going to go to South Beach, right? And you want a limousine for your friends. There's like 15 different limousine companies that you can call on. But limousine's a bad example. You want a private driver because it's you and your friends going out, private driver. So you're going to call this company and they're going to tell you something, and then this company here and this company here. And all of these companies are competing against one another. And they're all in this Miami town car competition kind of environment. And so, I like this. So now the only competition you have is called Uber. They basically consolidated all of those companies, Uber and Lyft. That's it. So they took all of these businesses and they essentially put them all out of business. And now they have Uber and Lyft. And there's individual drivers, obviously, that are all now individual contractors or independent contractors. But all of those drivers that used to work for those other companies, I'm assuming, would immediately go here. Plus, additional drivers that never used to drive taxis before, or drive personal cars before, are now working here. That just blows my mind that all of that completely shifted in 5 or 6 years. The previous model is that you have to have a license, which means you have to operate under somebody else's medallion. And if you operate on someone else's medallion, you had to pay them some sort of, you shared profit with them. Say your ride was $100, you had to pay them 50, you kept 50. And it was very well calculated. So that's how it used to work. So moving forward, the question is, so they don't have a car. Now they can still keep driving a taxi in 2025 if they wanted to, but obviously they're not making nearly as much fare, and maybe there's not nearly as much business. So that's option one. Option two is they're unemployed. I mean, they don't have a job, or they don't have a contract with a medallion person anymore. And so what would you do? I would choose to possibly get some money from my friends and family and lease a car or buy a car and try to become an Uber or Lyft driver. I think that would be the option if you want to stay within the industry. Any other thought? We essentially reduced barriers to entry and created more people that were entering the ride sharing market because the taxi cab drivers, it was limited, the amount of taxi cabs on the street, because they were controlled by this power of medallion holders. Okay, well done. And it's just incredible. I keep saying the same words over and over again because it really gets me to envision what it looks like applying strategy well and what business could look like 3, 4, 5 years from now. And if hopefully my goal we're not Uber. I'm not Uber. I don't work for Uber. None of us have founded Uber. And it's almost like, dang, why are we talking about this case? These people became really successful. But I promise you, there's elements of this thinking that you can apply to your business today. How can we make our experience via technology better for our customer, better for our employees, possibly even try to cut costs significantly, be in the same business, but be able to do it in a different way? How does that work? I keep referring back to the services that are delivered via plumber, electrician, because I care a lot about these trade service companies. There should be no reason why I shouldn't be able to get an quality air conditioning technician to my house within the next 45 minutes via app. And I just don't think that the HVAC industry has done that yet, but it will. Mark my words. The HVAC industry is going to be done via, it's very similar to Uber. And all the HVAC companies out there, love them to death, and I'm not making a prophecy, I just think this is a reality. All of their experienced technicians who are very, very good at what they do will now be in their own van operating as independent contractors. And they would be under the umbrella of this company, this company, this company. And they're going to have very fine-tuned ways in which they train their technicians and bring their technicians on board. And once they're under that umbrella, they're going to have business like crazy. And this is how did Uber shift the power of suppliers, the drivers, who had power before, who has it now? So this saying, and if you recall, the Netflix to be a very similar situation, and the terminology is that what made streaming possible, or what makes Uber possible, was the development of complementary technologies. In the case of Netflix, it was high bandwidth connections into the home through cable and fiber optic conduits, and the emergence of cloud computing infrastructure, most notably by Amazon Web Services. And I would say that the equivalent of complementary technologies for Uber would be GPS technologies combined with the App Store that Apple so brilliantly created and opened up anybody to create apps that can be used on their store. So I think complementary technologies was a real factor. I certainly wasn't thinking in 2010. My mindset was somewhere totally different. That hey, let me design an app to drive people around that can replace the taxi cab concept. But now that you look back, it was ready to be disrupted because it was a horrendous experience. The bargaining power of suppliers. And what Uber provides is the platform. And they have the power because they own the platform. We all know that there's other platforms that were developed as well, but ultimately the platform has sort of replaced the medallion. So the platform still has a lot of power, a lot of credibility. Yet because of how Uber it ran their business model, they gave some of that power to the drivers as well. And so the drivers have a little bit of power, not nearly as much power as the platform does. And then the other definition, I don't know what these would be, but the organizations that provide inputs, because the platform is what Uber provides. The inputs such as materials, services, and labor, which may be individuals, organizations such as labor unions or companies that supply contract labor into the industry. So those are the suppliers. So materials would be the cloud computing, like the things that house the app and the serviceability of the app using like AT&T would probably be a supplier, in a sense. They'd probably have some realm of phone usage and the proliferation of AT&T to be able to get them to obviously all of the phone companies to be able to have fast speeds so that the app could be used. I mean, they're a supplier. Services, the suppliers that make this experience happen. If we wanted to list them, we could probably list them. But the question is, do they have power? Yes, no, whatever that may look like. So now we're really honing in on what the suppliers to an industry mean and how important they are. And again, if you look at a different industry, and I want to make sure we're clear on this because we're not just talking about Uber, this is a learning concept for the class. The bargaining power of suppliers matter. Think about the automotive industry, making cars, manufacturing cars. With these tariffs becoming an issue, you have to think the suppliers of the materials to build the cars it's a problem. We don't own that. So we're beholden to the suppliers of the materials to give us these materials in a quality way, in a timely way, in a decently cost kind of way. So that supplier has a good amount of power. Think about the microchips out of Taiwan. That's a supplier. You better believe that the whole geopolitical tension around Taiwan is incredibly tense because Taiwan is the number one provider of microchips to everything we do. And so that's a big power right there. That demonstrates to you, hopefully that example drives home power of suppliers and how important they are. And what happened with COVID of this interruption of the suppliers interrupting the supply chain, it had this butterfly effect on a whole slew of other things. So it's a major factor within an industry. And I'll just make one other point here. If you think about entering an industry where the supplier power is really high, you better have a plan to figure out what's going to happen if that supplier decides to one day come in and tell you exactly what to do and how to do it. Because if you're at the beck and call of a supplier, then your entire business model is going to be kaput if that supplier doesn't supply you what you need. So that's why this bargaining power supplier is so very important. Okay, let's go to the third question. Group 3. It's how did Uber impact the bargaining power of buyers? This is probably the easiest one. Buyers would be the riders, and what changed from the taxi cab to the Uber? Everything changed. Let me try to break those two things down strategically because it's very interesting. Let's look at the one thing of entry into new markets. What does Uber want? They want the network effect. They want to be able to provide customers with the ability to find a driver within 5 minutes of you wherever you are. So what's their incentive? That's it. They want to make sure their customer has access to limousines. What is the consumer protection incentive, which is a high percentage that incentive that governments want? They want to make sure that their citizens are not being mistreated by malicious drivers that are out there to hurt people. And so that they're honestly, I mean, you would think they have good intent that they're trying to regulate the industry so that it's safer for passengers. And the taxi cab industry was fairly well regulated in the sense you had to have a yellow car, it had to have a light on it, they had to have a license, you had to have a background check. There was a lot of things that good regulation for weirdos that were going to come to your house and pick you up and do weird things. You don't want that to happen. So they want to make sure that doesn't happen. So Uber needs to as well, or should as well. They have no, they're a platform. They're independent contractors. These drivers are not under the power of Uber. They're going to act however they want to act. But what Uber can do is they can create essentially additional regulations that the app, the platform requires in order for you to sign up and drive. And so that's one. That's where the incentive of the government trying to protect its citizens and having good regulation around that. And this is why Uber is responding by cooperating with some of those regulations. So that mixture, that tension is actually a good thing. And it provides a better customer safety and consumer experience. Now, so number 2 would be the quality of food delivery and service of drivers. And that, I believe, Uber would be incentivized to collect that data from customers. Because if you have one really bad experience from Uber and you can't get in touch with the customer service rep and you decide to cancel Uber, the lifetime value of that customer is extremely high. If you shift your loyalty over to Lyft, Uber didn't just lose the say $20, they would have just paid you to reimburse you for your sandwich that drove off. Unfortunately, whoever said that, Tammy, or like that sucks. But Uber's going to pay you $20. Why? Because for the next 40 years of your life, if not more, you're going to be paying Uber fees, which is going to equate to thousands and thousands of dollars. So what do they want to do? Number 1, they want to keep your business. Number 2, that's a big deal because the lifetime value of a customer is extremely high. Number 2, they too want feedback on the drivers. Why do they want feedback on the drivers? Because they want to control the customer experience. So they solicit that feedback. You would think that would help them. So they're essentially crowd-sourced information sharing, kind of like how Waze built their app of signifying where traffic is and all this kind of stuff. Uber does the same thing by ratings and reviews and quality control standards and documenting how many callbacks they get and how many sandwiches drove off with a driver. Like they know this stuff. They want to know this stuff to get this data for them to make decisions. 2 fascinating points. I believe that I watched a video and I understood that there was a potential merger, or at least it was a news story about Toyota and Uber merging in some way or another. And because what is Uber lacking? Uber is lacking the physical assets of the cars. Uber only owns the platform. So if I'm Toyota and I'm making self-driving cars, then why do I need Uber? I send my self-driving car out to go pick someone up and I just basically charge them for the service. I don't need Uber. It's going to be a different platform that's going to order the self-driving car. And then the person who owns the asset of the car, because there's no driver, is going to reap all the economic rents from that service, I assume. So just think through, what would that look like? How would Uber be able to bring value, and what kind of capabilities and resources would they have in this environment where cars are driving themselves? The government control over the autonomous car industry, I don't have an answer, but it's obviously a concern, is how involved is government going to be regulating that industry? And I would think that I'd answer the question with the historical facts of the past, is that they couldn't stop Uber. So what makes you think they're going to stop what customers are likely going to demand in a self-driving car? I think it's inevitable that the efficiencies of life and the certainly for people who can afford it, they're not going to want to drive. And if they can get a self-driving car, which candidly a lot of people have them now, they're going to buy them and they're going to use them. I think it was last class when we did the Google case, and it's not about the features and benefits. It's so cool that autonomous cars can do this and that. That's wonderful, and it's important. What's important is understanding how, if you had the billions of dollars that Uber had to do product development over the next 10 years, what portion of that $100 billion would you allocate towards autonomous vehicle integration? Is it going to be another technological disruption within Uber's rideshare business? I mean, you better believe it. And you better believe a lot of industries are certainly gearing up for what autonomous drivers and the lack thereof of people driving the car, which is going to be a significant disruption within the labor market, and what that means for their life and for their company. It, I don't want to get into that conversation. I think that's a conversation for another class. We could probably talk about that for half an hour. But the question is, if you're thinking Uber and you're thinking future and you're thinking, the question was threats of substitutes. I think it was rivals and the rivalry of Hyundai coming with an autonomous car to pick you up. Why do you need an Uber app? Why would you ever use Uber ever again if Hyundai did that? So that's certainly a threat of rivalry in the future. So nice job, Drew. We'll go over to the last question. And some of the companies that I think we all know are Lyft, Bolt, Didi, Grab, and Ola in India. So when you think about the aspect of the industry rivalry, you're thinking specifically about the direct competition among existing firms, which would include taxi cab companies too, traditional taxi cab companies and other mobility platforms via Get and others that offer pooled or flexible routes. I understand basically what Uber did was Uber created space for other people to come in and invest billions of dollars and replicate their business. They allowed for that because they showed them the way. It's like that early entrant isn't always the most successful because you have later entrants that can come in and just replicate somebody else's strategy. And from what I understand, the fascinating thing is if you're competing on price in rideshare, there's actually better algorithms out there that are allowing drivers and riders to negotiate in real time. To somehow, like there's different algorithms being built that literally gives a range of how much a ride could cost to the airport. It could be $100 from Homestead. It could be $60 from Homestead. And by the time you get there, based on like the speed and the different times the person turned and maybe the temperature of the car, all sorts of different factors, they factor into what would be really a negotiated rate, like in real time. Again, I don't know the details of that, but somebody in another class explained that there's an app that's doing that now. That if that algorithm is better than Uber's, then it might compete. And because Uber did what it did, it made space for those kinds of new rivals to challenge Uber essentially. I'm thinking about all the money that the county of Miami-Dade put into public transit. You better believe that they were trying to figure out ways to compete with Uber. I agree. I don't think that the government can compete against private companies like Uber, especially where they're at right now. But that STS, I put the name of it, Special Transit Services. That is actually, and I commissioned or campaigned as a business owner in a city to. I spoke to the guy that's in charge of STS. I have a bunch of friends that have disabilities. My sisters had disabilities anyway. So I was involved in the community of people with disabilities. And I just believe that the SDS services, so I hear, were just inconsistent, unreliable. It was much easier just to take Uber. And a lot of people just did that as opposed to SDS, but they still had to pay for it. And so they were trying to get the SDS services to partner somehow with Uber and to figure out how to make it better because it was similar to the taxi cab experiences with this STS, which is called Special Transportation Services. There's a link. STS is a shared ride public transportation service of Miami-Dade County in compliance with the complementary paratransit service provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. STS offers door-to-door transportation service from the main entrance of pickup to the main entrance of drop-off locations. Sound familiar? The service operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and can be used throughout most of Miami-Dade County. The cost per trip is $3.50. So clearly it's subsidized by the government. But like I mentioned, and not to get into this whole case study, that the people who use this service have complained that it's difficult, it's unreliable, it's not that great, and that using Uber is much more reliable and is much better. But obviously they have to pay to use those services. And a lot of cars that come are not handicap accessible. They don't have the same ADA requirements that are needed for the STS vehicles. Fascinating. So Uber may very well, and they probably do, have an option for certain kinds of cars to cater to people with disabilities, and they're going to compete again with the government with that kind of stuff. Doing an industry analysis, doing it in detail, and having some thought behind it, and using your technology and your research skills to be able to discuss, what the heck is happening here? Why are buyers making all the pricing decisions? How are suppliers constraining us? What are these five forces? Why are they important? And should we continue to operate within this industry, or how should we compete within this industry based on what we know now? All right, so I just want to point out two concepts that are in the textbook and that are important to understand. You're thinking about this macro environment. You got the government, you got social cultural issues, you got political issues, you have economic issues. These are things that are really outside of our control. And then within the industry, you have buyer power, supplier power, you have all of the five forces that we just talked about, and then there's you, and you have to function within this turbulent space. And so, what are some ways that organizations kind of band together to collaborate with one another in something called a strategic group? This happens often, and here are some examples. In the airline industry, this actually says commercial aerospace industry. What you're going to see is what you see now is you see this particular strategic group. You see Boeing and Airbus, essentially manufacturers of these larger jets. And you know that Boeing and Airbus allows for American Airlines and Southwest. They make a lot of these big planes. And it's just only a few players in the space. So what do? They sort of group together and they cooperate with one another so that they're not killing each other. And there's some agreements they have with one another to compete in a certain kind of way. So these strategic groups certainly happen. And here you see another strategic group. It's still in the aerospace industry, but they just have less seats and they can't fly as far. So this is Bombardier, Embraer, and Fokker. Fokker, say that too many times, but that is a strategic group in the regional jets versus large jets. So you can see how this strategic group can kind of band together and they don't have price wars. They have some kind of agreements. They maybe share industry information. So they figure out how do we make this thing work? And it's a strategic group because they're both in the airlines business. They're not really competing against one another because these folks over here in regional jets and these folks over here in large jets. So it's different segments. And then of course you have players in those segments as well. So it's just an interesting concept to lay out for you so that you can see what that means. Since all companies in the strategic group pursue a similar strategy, customers view them as direct substitutes for each other. The most immediate threats to a company are rivals within its own strategic group. And so the question is, should they move from one strategic group to another? It's called the role of mobility barriers within industry factors that inhibit the movement of companies between strategic groups. So let me see if I can think of another example of this. You got Burger King, Wendy's, and McDonald's. And the question is, are they going to get into the sit down and dine in waiter service restaurant industry? I mean, they're in the same food service industry. They're just in the fast food service industry. So it's a strategic group within the fast food business. And so the question is, are they going to get more into, the food business in a different kind of way? And the answer for that example is probably no. There's not a lot of mobility that they can use from one strategic group to a different strategic group. So you can see how that's not much. But if you have like Chipotle, can Chipotle get into say they're in the food and beverage business? Should they start competing with coffee? Can they be in a strategic group with coffee? Can they move from Mexican food to coffee? Maybe that mobility isn't as difficult. So they could move from one group to another group. It just depends. So that's kind of the goal. I don't know if that made a lot of sense to you, but this happens often. And so if let's look at Miami-Dade College, FIU, and University of Miami. Yes, they compete with one another, but they also cooperate with one another as well. And I would say that FIU and Miami-Dade College are a little bit more strategically aligned in a strategic group than Miami-Dade College and UM. UM might be in a different strategic group where it's a private university and their tuition might be super high. It's a different kind of student. Maybe they have medical degrees and whatnot. Whereas FIU and NBC, they cooperate a little bit better with one another. But you better believe that they're in the same industry. They're just doing things cooperatively a little bit differently. So hopefully that example helped. You can see what a strategic group is like and how it can make it a little bit easier within the industry to compete by partnering somehow with one another. So what does that do back to strategic groups again? What does that do for the consumer? Well, strategic groups sometimes could be bad for consumers because they collude with one another and they could negotiate prices, which is illegal essentially for competitors to get together and do that. But it does happen and they might call it something else. But so it could be bad for customers because they're sort of grouped together where they can control a lot of things. But also it could be good for customers because they offer additional services and they're sharing information with one another and they're sharing inventions and ideas and hopefully producing things in the marketplace that are of better quality. So that's kind of the essence of that. So the last topic we're going to talk about is this life cycle of industries. And we're going to break down each one of them quickly. You're going to see this often. And also, by the way, this isn't just an industry concept. This is a business life cycle concept as well. You can replace these words with venture development, the growth stage, the maturity stage, the decline stage. I mean, business life cycle and industry life cycle sort of have this similar concept. If you think about the Fortune 500 companies that were Fortune 500 companies 20 years ago, that list, there's 200 companies that weren't even on that list today, 20 years ago. So obviously industries change, the taxi cab industry changes, businesses go through this life cycle framework as well. And it's important that we sort of understand why what is the strategic implications of understanding these different life cycle stages of an industry. So the embryonic stage, which is really the development stage, its growth is slow due to the fact that, I mean, COVID did a lot for the grocery delivery business. I would never, in my wildest dreams, want somebody to go to the supermarket and buy bananas for me. I wanted to go to the supermarket and buy bananas. I loved it when my grandfather and I would go to the super. It was a trip. It was fun. I enjoyed the supermarket. It was always a part of my life. When the technology came out that other people can grocery shop for me, I didn't care about it. This was the embryonic stage of this industry, and I'm just speaking from a consumer perspective, so you can understand. There was no need. I wasn't educated about it. I didn't know how it worked. Whatever. Once COVID came, we were forced to start buying our groceries online. My daughter was going through cancer treatments actually at the time, and so we had a lot of restrictions. So therefore, going to the grocery store wasn't a good idea. Therefore, we were going to purchase our groceries from somebody who's going to deliver them. So you get the point. Is once we found out that this thing exists, and once we understood how it worked, and once we became comfortable with it, that's when we started using it more. So buyers' unfamiliarity with the product or poor distribution channels is a huge factor from going from an embryonic stage to a growth stage. So now people know about Uber. They understand that people deliver packages to your house. There's autonomous cars. Obviously, we'll have the same concept when they first start coming out onto the market. And so now we have to say, okay, so now we move past this hurdle of embryonic to growth. First time demand expands rapidly due to new customers in the market. Prices fall, similar to where Uber is now, because scale economies have been attained. Distribution channels have been developed. So this understanding of ride sharing markets, this is out there. Platforms are set up and competition started to enter. Threat from potential competitors is high during the growth stage, rivalry is low. People see blood in the water, if you use the technology or that terminology, but they see blood in the water and they start coming and they want to eat. They want to see how they can make profits in this particular space. When I say they, you're talking about institutional investors, private equity companies. These are other large companies like Google has a bunch of spinoffs, and Microsoft has a bunch of entrepreneurial endeavors that they're kind of going on. It's called corporate venturing. So obviously they're going to invest in an industry where they see that there's growth, there's potential here. So they start coming in after they see the blood in the water, and they start competing. And so now embryonic, thank God we made it past that. Now the buyers understand. Now we're in growth. And now you have this shakeout stage, and I love this concept. So I have three daughters, and again, the crude example. If a daughter, they're very young, so but I envision this day in my mind often as some 18-year-old boy, hopefully whatever, comes to my door and is like, "Sir, I'm here to take your daughter for a date." And immediately, this guy's in the shakeout phase. It's like he's not coming in my house, and I mean, sort of joking, but the point is, I got to ask some questions here. I got to see, what's going on. Are you responsible? Let me look at your car. Let me take a look at your background check. Let me bring you in and smell you. Do you smell like marijuana? What's going on with this guy? And I'm shaking him out. And so that analogy, I'm sure you can picture in your mind me doing that, essentially putting somebody that is going to take my daughter out on a date through this shakeout period, through this testing. This is what the industry does too for the good companies. So when we talk about strategy, you have to not only be able to get into a market, get customer demand, then you have to be resilient enough as an organization and cash flowing enough to be able to endure things like COVID or endure things like online retailing or endure things like technological disruptions. Because if you can't endure that, you're not going to make it past the shakeout phase, and you're going to be the Kmart's of the world and the Dick's, or sorry, the Sports Authorities of the world and the Toys R Us's of the world. You're not going to make it. And so that is the shakeout stage. And so growth and demand and capacity, let's get rid of that. So now mature industries, market is totally saturated. Demand is limited to replacement demand and growth is low or zero. So mature industries, I mentioned again, are industries where they have fairly consistent demand. The profit margins are low. It's not as risky. So let's go back to this graph just for a second. If you're a venture capitalist and you want 80% return, you're investing in companies or in companies who are operating in industries at the embryonic phase. And then, of course, if you want, say, like a 50% return, it's pretty certain you're going to invest in these companies at the growth stage. There's still a large chance that they're going to fail right here. So this is risky. This is riskier. This is risky. And then once you get here, the risk level is a lot lower. And then obviously there's still some meat to eat here if you want to get involved in a declining industry, but it's likely not a great future path. And when we think about strategy, we talk about corporate level strategy, we talk about diversifying. And diversifying, there's a interesting analogy about cash cows, rising stars, and other ones that are called like dogs. It's essentially a model to understand your portfolio. And in your portfolio, you got to have a few rising stars. You got to have some risky endeavors. You have to have some consistent growth. So if you diversify your portfolio and you do a decent job diversifying, you might hit on some of the companies in the embryonic stage. You might just cash flow on the companies in the maturity stage, and then hopefully you're going to avoid the decline stage altogether. So as you can see, this particular understanding of the life cycle stage is an important one. Shakeout, mature stage, decline stage, we understand what it is. Okay, so there are limitations to this industry analysis and looking through what does it mean? Why do we spend so much time on this, Professor Kershner? Why do we keep talking about this 20% factor? And so here are some of the ways that scholars have said that yes, the industry analysis is important, but it has its limitations. Industries do not always follow the pattern of the industry lifecycle model. Time span of the stages vary from industry to industry. Innovation, punctuated equilibrium, in which periods of equilibrium are punctuated by periods of rapid change. So innovation disrupts everything. And so the predictability about an industry like the taxi cab industry in 2003, it might have been a great, you go through an industry analysis, you're like, of course I want to enter this industry. It looks amazing. And then boom, innovation happens and it changes everything. Change. Because competitive forces and strategic group models are static, they cannot capture periods of rapid change in the industry environment when value is migrating. Company differences overemphasize industry structure as a determinant of company performance, underemphasize variations among companies within a strategic group. Quite sure I had the energy to explain that any further. We talked, pretty much done. I will say some closing remarks and we'll be done. But this is actually a pretty cool image if you're looking at the screen of what we talked about in the beginning of the class, which is that external environment. And then this would be considered the, if I can find, this would be considered the task environment in here, task. And then to just kind of move that out, this would be your internal environment. So you understand that this is turbulence. These are things we can't really change, but we have to prepare our internal environment to adapt and to anticipate things happening here. And we can certainly study and strategically make decisions to hold off competitors and to get power over suppliers, get power over buyers, and be able to compete well within this internal industry dynamic. I think this visual is actually really cool to understand a lot of things. We talked about the macroeconomics. So at every class that you'll go into when you think about entrepreneurship and creating a business, they're going to have a section of the business plan, or at least when you're thinking about this venture, to do an industry analysis. So I really highly encourage you to use that IBIS World Report that you all have access to. You should, hopefully all of you have done that already, and you're going to produce a report and give it to your boss sometime this week and say you're welcome. Maybe you can do a little summary of it as well. Industry analysis is important, but it only goes so far. We only have so much control over it. And it supplies us with a foundation that we're going to take with us into the decisions that we're going to make through the rest of the class. So I'm happy we got some time to look at Uber tonight. I think that's a fascinating industry disruptor. And I want to pinpoint what Uber did was they saw an opportunity to disrupt an industry and they did it. What most companies do is they understand the five forces of the industry and they figure out ways to compete within it. They don't necessarily try to change it. They just organize their business and they organize their resources and their capabilities so that they can compete within it, so that they can respond to these things. Let me give you one example. So we had the pool company, and we had a bunch of pool maintenance accounts, and on every pool maintenance account, it was a large bargaining power of buyers. It was a bargaining power of buyers because they could negotiate our prices, and it was very easy for them to negotiate our prices. So our bargaining power of buyers was high, meaning the company, that's not good for us. So what did we do to counter the bargaining power of buyers? And I promise you, a lot of mechanic shops do this as well. Well, we build history on the account. If we didn't have the account, obviously we wouldn't be able to negotiate it. But when we would build history on the account, meaning we understand where their equipment is, we'd understand when our pool was built, we'd make sure we document every time we went to the property. So when the house changed hands, like somebody else came in and bought it, or they were thinking about firing us because we were too expensive or we messed up, then what we would say is we understand, but we would present them with the history of our services at the house. So we touched this pool, 260 times, and each time we touched it, here's what we did. Here was the tech who worked on it. So we have like essentially the only person in possession of the history of this pool. So that would allow us to downsize the bargaining power of our buyers. It gave us more power. So that's something practical to think of. Another one, when you think about barriers to entry, threats of competitors coming into the market and taking our accounts. Every time we pick up an account, any account that we had, we'd label all of the equipment. And what does that mean? So we take our logo and our phone number, and we'd put pump, filter, motor, heater, and then right on anything that had buttons that somebody could mess up, we would say, please call Reef Tropical at 305-367-2005 prior to changing any of these settings. And we'd essentially put these labels on their equipment, and we do it in a fashionable way so that when they came out to their equipment and something wasn't working, they would know that we own this equipment. And so even if there was a competitor that came and took our account, let's say that the competitor that came to take our account didn't remove all the labels on day 3, 4, 5, the homeowner's wife or daughter or brother or sister or uncle that's staying at the house goes out to the pool because something's not working. What do? They call us. And what do? We're not, oh, I'm sorry, that's not our account anymore. No, we go right out there and say, how you doing? Nice to see you. Of course, we can fix this up for you. So we were trying to essentially own the equipment. So those are just some practical examples that when you're in business, how do you garner against these these particular threats. And I'll give you one more example. When we scaled with the platform company of Pool Centurion, so now we've merged essentially with a bunch of other pool companies. Now the platform company has a lot of bargaining power with suppliers. Now we're much bigger. So we're buying chlorine in much bulkier kind of ways. So one of the initiatives that we'd work on immediately was go and negotiate with all of our suppliers because we had bigger economies of scale. And so bargaining with our suppliers was very helpful for us because we saved a lot of money in operations because now we're much bigger. We have more bargaining power with our suppliers. So this kind of stuff happens all the time. And hopefully it's relevant to you. And hopefully it becomes a part of our language for the rest of the semester. And certainly when you guys go into the case studies and you do your case study, I think it would be beneficial for all of us if you just want to run through a quick Porter's five forces so we understand the dynamics of the industry, let's say the automobile industry or any of these other cases that we have coming up. Don't spend too much time on it. It shouldn't take any more than 2 or 3 minutes, but it at least runs through these 5 forces so we can understand the industry a little bit better. All right, y'all. Thanks for participating tonight.
It's inspirational
Sorry,
when you reflect on some of these leaders that one might consider to be heroes and think about their lives